Hello, everybody. So I would like to thank you all for being here to attend our panel discussion. My name is Stelios Orfanidis. I'm a Cypriot reporter. I work for OCCRP. And I have with me three very good friends. We have Olga Lautman from New York, who works at the Center for European Policy Analysis, which is based in DC. She's an expert on Russian kleptocracy, subversive actions, and hybrid warfare. We have also Makarios Drousiotis, who's at the center. He's a Cypriot investigative reporter and historian, as well as an author of books about the recent history of Cyprus. To the right, we have Šarūnas Černiauskas. He's a fellow colleague at OCCRP, one of the leading co-investigators in the laundromat investigations we had in the past, as well as a participant in other investigative projects such as the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, Paradise Papers, and so on. He has a significant record in getting illicit assets frozen. So I would like to first start with Olga. Olga, today is a very special day for Russia, as well as for the world and investigative journalism. Could you tell us why?
First of all, I need to turn the microphone. Hello? Okay. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today. And yes, today is a very special day in Russia because 16 years ago today, on Putin's birthday, an investigative journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, was murdered. And she was a fierce critic of Putin and was exposing corruption with the Kremlin, the atrocities that Russia was committing in Chechnya, and paid with her life. And then from there, I mean, we had so many journalists inside of Russia who paid with their life for simply investigating corruption, you know, the schemes by the Kremlin, their atrocities that they were committing, all their human rights crimes, and that's it. And they were simply doing their job. And, you know, we thought that the West at the time overlooked a lot of these deaths inside of Russia. And, you know, had they paid attention, journalists would have been in a better situation today around the globe. But unfortunately, they ignored it. And as a result, from inside Russia, with the mass, you know, murders of journalists and jailings, it trickled out into the West. It trickled out across the globe. And you saw journalists come under fire just for simply doing their job and asking for accountability from their government or investigating, you know, financial schemes or corruption. So today I just wanted to take this moment to remember her because, you know, she paid with her life for doing what everyone here is doing.
If I may ask you, since the beginning of the invasion, let me rephrase the question, okay? We have a deterioration of the situation of press freedom in Russia. And the murder of Politkovskaya was a major milestone. But things continued getting worse over the years. We had very recently, in recent years, an obligation for certain media to post a disclaimer that they were acting as foreign agents. But how has the situation changed after the launch of the invasion in February?
Okay. So it's twofold. Inside of Russia, the situation has deteriorated Very badly. I mean, Putin is literally another Stalin and has brought Soviet conditions for journalists. Well, I mean, there are very few independent journalists who are still operating inside of Russia. Most have fled by now. For outside, the problem is that a lot of the Kremlin's, oligarchs, businessmen who move the Kremlin's money, they, felt way too comfortable in the West, and they used our institutions. They, captured our politicians, influential figures inside of various institutions and courts. So prior to Russia's latest brutal assault on Ukraine, because the war started in 2014, they were very comfortable in trying to silence journalists in Europe and America by using slaps or lawsuits, which are extremely costly and intimidating, and act as a deterrent, because many journalists, it can prevent them from not only tracking Russia's money moving through the West and in our institutions, but also from their own governments who are assisting Russia and conducting foreign policy of their own countries on the behalf of, another country. So prior to the war, it was easier. Now a lot of these businessmen and oligarchs, that particularly close to Putin, have been sanctioned and banned from traveling to the West. So it's become a lot harder for them, and it's become easier for journalists to do their investigative, investigations. But again, it depends on what country it is, because recently, just the other day in France, there was a businessman, a Russian businessman who apparently has influence in France, and there's a lot of influence from Russia inside of France, who was under sanctions close to Putin, and just in an appeals case had his seized yacht returned over procedural issues. So, I mean, you see them now becoming, again, more emboldened, and again, in countries more friendlier to them, using the institutions to now try to receive their seized assets, or I'm sure it's going to go to the point of trying to have sanctions lifted. But in countries that are completely captured by Russia, that's still a problem, and it still becomes, it's very dangerous for, journalists to operate. And my colleague is going to discuss what's happening in Cyprus and the restrictions on journalists there, particularly when exposing ties between Russia and their government and their institutions.
So, one of my major questions is whether it's safer now for journalists to investigate Russian illicit money. Is it safer? Is it easier? Is it more complicated? How do you assess the situation now?
Again, it depends where they're operating. So in Eastern Europe and America right now, it's much easier to investigate any kind of money laundering or any kind of money moving from the Kremlin through their numerous shell companies and networks. And you'll have support from the government. Obviously, like Treasury will not tell you where to look, but at least they won't hinder you from looking. And at the same time, a lot of these individuals have come under U.S. sanctions, and every week there's a new sanctions list rolling out. So it's definitely becoming easier. But again, in other countries, like in the Balkans and Cyprus, and where Russia has a pro-Kremlin government in place, it still is very hard.
And are the oligarchs themselves, are they still as potent as they used to be in the past?
No, they've definitely been weakened, because right now they're trapped inside of Russia, and they're banned from traveling here, and for the most part, a lot of EU countries, like all the bank accounts, all the companies, their assets are under scrutiny and in the process of either being seized or have been seized. So it's definitely right now, but again, it depends where, because then in Cyprus we see the opposite. We see they feel safer there, so they're moving their activities there at a greater rate than, for instance, they did in the UK prior, which, the UK is dubbed London grad from how much money and influence there was by Russian oligarchs.
Good. Could we go over to Šarūnas?
Hi.
Hi. You have a lot of experience in investigating illicit Russian money, and please tell us your experience. What has changed in your job since the end of February?
Well, that's the thing. When it comes to freezing money that belongs to Russian oligarchs, to Putin's inner circle, to his trustees, that information has been there for years. I can give the best and the most obvious example, I guess, the superstar of the Panama Papers investigation, Sergei Roldugin. Everybody knew the guy, everybody knew that he's in no position to operate a multi-billion empire of shell companies that owns lots and lots of assets across the globe, that shifts vast amounts of money instantly from one location to another, but it took a war to get Roldugin on the sanction list. On the one hand, when I saw that name on the sanction list, I was of course happy. I was one of the people who were on the initial team that uncovered the wealth behind Roldugin, or kept by Roldugin, which is widely considered to be actually Putin's personal fortune. But it took a war. It took a massacre to get that name on that list. The current boom of sanctions, both in Europe and in the US, is actually largely thanks to the job that the journalists did. It's not about the international projects that we all know and speak of. Here, I would like also to take a minute to give proper credit and thank our colleagues in Russia. When the war began on day one, Stelios, I know you also received that email. One of our colleagues emailed all of us and said that he's feeling ashamed. He's feeling ashamed because he didn't do enough. Because he didn't do enough to prevent this war, to do enough reporting, to expose the regime so something would actually change. And that was very touching, and it really, really shook me, but I said he was wrong. The guys in Russia, they did a tremendous job. They risked their freedom, they risked their safety, they risked their family's safety. Many of them risked their lives to actually show what's happening. The thing is, not enough people give a damn. And that's the most painful issue about this. Yeah, now we have a world record, I guess, when it comes to imposing sanctions on numerous entities and individuals. But where was that 5 years ago? Yeah, we did have a boom after Crimea was annexed, but so what? There were multiple proxies of the Kremlin regime that kept on operating, that kept on moving money into the Western financial sector. We have companies reliant on Russian money. We have a real estate sector reliant on Russian money. We have a yachting industry reliant on Russian money. We have all of that, and that money flow hasn't been stopped. It was exploited as a tool of Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere, simply put. It was exploited as a tool to undermine any real efforts to actually weaken the regime. And that's why now we have what we have. And also when it comes to declaring sanctions on someone and getting them to work, that's two different things. It's easy to put an individual on a sanctions list and say that across Europe this guy has all of his assets frozen. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't. The only thing that's certainly efficient when it comes to sanctions is the travel ban. Yeah, they can't enter EU territory, okay. But when it comes to actually freezing assets, it's not automatic. It's not like somebody flips a switch in the financial police in London and all of a sudden all the assets of a certain oligarch just gets frozen like that. No, it doesn't work that way. In many cases, those assets have to be exposed prior to getting frozen. And that's where the work of journalists comes in again. And now we have an unprecedented number of names and companies to investigate. If a company gets listed on the sanctions list, yeah, of course we jump in and see if that company owns something in our countries. If an individual does, yet again. And it's a painstaking work. It's still, I think, quite impossible to grasp. And here's why I think the model we developed at OCCRP, at ICIJ, that's when we see how efficient this is, because we can bring journalists together. We can bring journalists from across Europe together for a single project. And this was the case of OCCRP's Russian asset tracker. The idea of the project was to create a comprehensive database of assets owned by sanctioned individuals across multiple jurisdictions. That project worked, and the key to it was listing both known and unknown assets of the sanctioned individuals with definite evidence that a particular asset is linked to that person. And that is extremely efficient when it comes to actually implementing sanctions. Because when you present in the public domain the actual evidence that this company or this yacht is directly linked to this guy, well, then the national agencies have to act. That information is laying there in the broad daylight, and that's why we mustn't stop working, and we don't. In my case, well, I can tell a pretty simple example. When it all boomed, when the sanction list began expanding almost on a daily basis, I was lost and overwhelmed because I didn't know where to look for. Lithuania was shockingly late with developing the ultimate beneficiary registry for the country, which is mandatory. We're years behind schedule in the EU. So I just went fishing. I had a database, a data set of companies in Lithuania that are owned by foreign companies. So basically it was just basic logic. At first you filter out companies owned by entities registered in Cyprus because it's a favorite jurisdiction for Russian oligarchs. Then you have the financial data, so you filter out the companies with the biggest turnover, and there's a company owned by a sanctioned individual. We just found it actually on the same day when the guy was included on the sanctions list. So we ran a really quick story, and the result was freezing 3 million euros in assets instantly on the same day. And exchanging information, collaborating with your colleagues in other countries, including people from Russia, it's essential because there are many great journalists in Russia who are in pain. They see what their country has become, they've been working for years to change it, and they want to keep on working. And they are willing to help anyone. So if you want to do it, just jump in, because we're never going to have enough people working on it.
Okay, Šarūnas, before I continue with the next question to you, Olga has something to add to something you said.
I just wanted to add, we keep speaking about Russian oligarchs and businessmen, and there's a reason for that. What some may not realize is that these oligarchs and businessmen solely exist because of the Kremlin. And they use, they are the ones who move the Kremlin's money throughout Europe, throughout United States, Canada, Africa, Middle East. And a lot of this money is, one, to hide Putin's wealth, and he's deemed to be the richest man on the planet, and to hide their own wealth. And also because they're using this money to fund terrorist operations inside of the Middle East, in Syria. And we've seen this, through excellent reporting against Cyprus companies and shell companies. And they also fund operations to subvert our democracy. So this is the reason we're so much focused on the oligarchs and the Russian businessmen, because they are not just simply, stealing money from Russia and then going to buy a yacht. They're also using this money to destroy the West, to attack democracy, to undermine democracy, and to cause chaos within countries. So we're too busy fighting in our own countries versus, trying to improve our country, while they continue to gain more influence in our countries.
Good. The next thing I would like to ask you, Šarūnas, is your assessment about how impactful the work that we do now is compared to how it was 8 months ago. Have things changed, or have things started to change?
Yeah, I think that things did change, and of course it's because of the political situation. 8 months ago, a year ago, 3 years ago, if any of us in any of our countries would have exposed some assets linked to a high-ranking individual connected to the Kremlin, well, it would be a good story that would cause quite a lot of noise, but in many cases, in many countries, I doubt that that would lead to some significant action by the government authorities. Now it's different. Now they must react because, well, Ukraine is still on the spotlight. And money connected to the Kremlin is not something you want to have in your country. It's not something the general public wants to have. With some exceptions, maybe. Exceptions like, unfortunately, Serbia, unfortunately, Hungary, which is a European country, European Union country still. Yeah, I was actually shocked by what happened in Hungary when Orban was trying to sabotage the sanction mechanism in the early days of the war, and it had totally insignificant impact on the outcome of the election. But I guess we should touch that as a different topic later on. But yeah, journalism has a lot of potential now, and if we act, if we uncover more and more of the assets connected to the Kremlin, we have a huge chance of actually having an impact. And it's both sad and wonderful moment for journalism, because I don't remember a time when investigative journalism had so much potential to actually reach real impact.
And since the beginning of the war, we have seen a mass exodus of journalists, of Russian journalists from their country. Many media are now, Russian media, are operating from abroad. Do you think this changes something? I mean, they are not under the direct control of the Kremlin anymore, but on the other hand, they're out of the country. To what extent can they contribute to the overall investigation of illicit activities and money flows and so on?
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and unfortunately I've seen many of my friends and colleagues flee Russia when the war began, because, well, the risk is nearly unbearable. They had to leave, they had to set up organizations in the EU so they could keep operating. But also, some people stayed. Some people stayed and they willingly took the risk, because you need people on the ground. You need people who can actually meet live sources, obtain information that can't be obtained otherwise. You need people doing the job. And of course, with the internet and the World Wide Web and the speedlight connections we have, of course you can operate from abroad, but still people inside the country are needed. And it's also I can present an example of what we had with Belarus, because we had a lot of good reporters in Belarus, but they were all forced to exile. Now there's, I don't know, only a handful of people still trying to operate in Belarus as independent journalists, because, well, they have targets on their backs, almost literally. In Russia it's the same thing, and they can still operate, of course. Those guys have connections, they have experience, they have the know-how. They can still do the digging from a safe distance. And I'm really happy about that. I'm not that happy about the fact that the safety of Russian journalists, the way they were treated, was systematically ignored by the West for decades. It began with Politkovskaya, it began with Putin's coming to power, because he came to power with the foundation of the current propaganda apparatus. That's when it began. That's when the freedom of speech began to be undermined. And knowledge is power. If you have people seeing what's really happening, seeing how corrupt the regime is, how their country is being robbed on a daily basis, I do think the Russian people would have acted. But by ignoring the fact that the Russian government was attacking the freedom of speech and the freedom of information. By ignoring that, the Western politicians basically laid the foundation for the current dictatorship we have. And that's why we have not that many people taking the streets to protest the war. That's why we have the sad phenomenon that more Russians hit the borders after the mobilization was announced. More people were, well, because, yeah, everybody's afraid to die. And also everybody's afraid to, get their asses kicked when they try to say, I'm against something. And we, the West, we laid the foundations for it by ignoring the systematic abuse of journalists in Russia. The West should have defended the freedom of speech in Russia, but it was never a priority. And now, that's why we have an absolutely brainwashed country. It's sad, but it's a fact.
And before we go to Makarios, I would like to ask you a minor question that has to do with how we did our job as journalists, okay? When it comes to those countries in the West who have practically undermined all this process that would have helped us hold Putin to account, or even Lukashenko and other dictators. To what extent do you think we've done our job correctly?
You mean the countries or the journalists?
Yeah, we journalists, okay, to what extent have we done our job properly, exposing those governments who are nominally in the West, but practically operate as proxies of the Putin regime or Lukashenko and so on?
I guess it depends on the country. In some countries, there's virtually no free media. Take Hungary as an example. There's only a handful of journalists that still try to operate aside from the Orban regime. And that's a textbook example of when things go out of hand and when Europe fails to preserve the freedom of speech within its own borders. In other countries, connection to Kremlin is basically a death sentence for a politician. In Lithuania, if a major politician gets exposed with a Kremlin connection, he's dead. I mean, he can still get elected, but he's not going to be near any political power for at least a decade. In France, we have Marine Le Pen, who was directly funded by Russia, and she's still a front-runner when it comes to the elections. Look at Italy. We have Matteo Salvini, who was bargaining for Russian money and was caught with it, and he's now going to be one of the guys that's forming the coalition. I think it's also some sort of a geographical thing, because, us, the Baltic states, Poland, we're damn scared of Russia, it's next door. When it comes to Italy, France, yeah, whatever. Yeah, it's war. It's painful, but it's not that close. So people do not relate that much, and they don't feel it as threatening as we do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Olga.
I just wanted to add something. Investigative journalists have done an amazing job, uncovering the assets and the shell companies. And I mean, you start with one company and with like over 500 by the time you finish your investigation. But my critique is to regular journalists and regular media outlets in the West, because what happens is, and this has been happening for, so long, that they end up laundering Russian propaganda without even realizing it. And, Russia's propaganda, is probably their strongest asset since Soviet days. And they end up, like with Ukraine. I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, they were talking about Russian separatists, Russian-backed government. There's no such a thing. A Russian separatist is either Russian mercenaries, Russian intel agents, or other Russian military operatives. And a Russian-backed government is, a government installed. So they invaded Crimea, they annexed Crimea, they invaded eastern Ukraine, Donbass, and installed their own governments there illegally. And then, unfortunately, when you look through Western media, oh, the Russian-backed government had an election, and it's still happening. I mean, I just criticized on Twitter, I believe it was New York Times, who wrote this up, like, oh, Russian-backed separatists, you know, invaded, are having an election. I mean, and even when covering elections inside of Russia, there are no elections. There haven't been elections forever. It went from Putin, then he installed Medvedev, and then from Medvedev it went back to Putin, but they still, you know, wrote about it as if it's a legitimate election. So that's my only critique. Western journalists have to do a better job understanding what's happening inside the countries and to report correctly. That way it doesn't confuse regular people, and it doesn't, you know, end up laundering Russian propaganda throughout our media outlets.
Good, thank you, Olga. So I would like to come to Makarios, and since, Makarios, you have been one of the top, maybe the top investigative journalists in Cyprus, you have been exposing corruption in the system for many years. And to some extent, how do you feel? Does your message come through?
Good afternoon. So since there is a translation facility, I will speak in Greek, if you don't mind. Άκουσα από τους συναδέλφους πολλές φορές τη λέξη Κύπρος. Και πριν απαντήσουμε την ερώτηση, νομίζω να πούμε λίγα λόγια γιατί η Κύπρος θεωρείται και είναι μια χώρα που εξυπηρετεί τα ρωσικά συμφέροντα. Η Κύπρος είναι ένα μικρό κράτος στην Ανατολική Μεσόγειο. Είναι ίσως το μόνο δυτικό κράτος από τη δεκαετία του 60, όταν ιδρύθηκε, μέχρι σήμερα, που είναι υπό ρωσική επιρροή για πολιτικούς λόγους, για θρησκευτικούς, για πολιτισμικούς. Είναι ένα άλλο θέμα, μεγάλο θέμα, να μην το συζητήσουμε. Η μόνη περίοδος που η Κύπρος ήταν εκτός ρωσικής επιρροής ήταν η δεκαετία μετά την κατάρρευση της Σοβιετικής Ένωσης, όταν ήταν ο Ιέλτσιν στην εξουσία, και τότε ήταν η Κύπρος που μπόρεσε και έγινε μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Όταν η Κύπρος έγινε μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, η Ρωσία δεν ήταν σε θέση να αντιδράσει για να ανακόψει αυτή την πορεία, όμως αποφάσισε να χρησιμοποιήσει την Κύπρο ως ρωσικό προτεκτοράτο εντός της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Γι' αυτό, επειδή υπήρχαν αυτοί οι δεσμοί, για ιστορικούς λόγους που, όπως είπατε, είναι του παρόντος, η Κύπρος ήταν πρόσφορο έδαφος τη δεκαετία αμέσως μετά την ένταξη στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση και την ένταξη στο ευρώ, για να εξελιχθεί σε ένα φορολογικό παράδεισο για τα ρωσικά χρήματα και ένας προορισμός για τους Ρώσους ολιγάρχες. Η κυπριακή οικονομία είναι πολύ μικρή, η χώρα είναι μικρή, τα χρήματα που διακινούνταν ήταν τεράστια για το μέγεθος, οπότε υπήρχε πάρα πολύ ρωσικό χρήμα στην αγορά και τότε δημιουργήθηκε μια νέα τάξη πολυεκατομμυριούχων που ήταν κυρίως δικηγόροι, πολιτικοί και δικηγόροι, μαζί το ίδιο, λογιστές, ελεγχτές, και δημιουργήθηκαν οι συνθήκες, ιδίως μετά την ένταξη της Κύπρου στο ευρώ, για το ξέπλυμα βρώμικου ρωσικού χρήματος, το οποίο ερχόταν στην Κύπρο, μετατρεπόταν σε ευρώ και μετά επενδυόταν ξανά στην Ρωσία ως ευρωπαϊκή επένδυση, αντί ρωσική επένδυση, που ήταν δύο οι λόγοι. Ο ένας ήταν διότι ξεπλένονταν τα χρήματα και ο δεύτερος ήταν ότι μια ευρωπαϊκή επένδυση στη Ρωσία ήταν πιο ασφαλής από μια ρωσική επένδυση. Στην Κύπρο υπήρχαν, πρώτα απ' όλα δημιουργήθηκαν μεγάλα οικονομικά συμφέροντα στο σύστημα εξουσίας, διότι ήταν πολλά τα χρήματα. Οι Ρώσοι είχαν φυσική παρουσία στο τραπεζικό τομέα με τράπεζες. Υπήρχαν διάφορα οικονομικά projects στην Κύπρο και υπήρχαν και media projects. Οπότε δεν υπήρχε απολύτως καμιά κριτική για αυτά που συνέβαιναν στην Κύπρο. Ήταν περισσότερο θεωρείται ως ευλογία παρά ως κατάρα. Έλαχε και ήμουν ο πρώτος που αμφισβήτησε αυτό το σύστημα κάποια στιγμή και με αρθρογραφία και με κάποια βιβλία που εξέδωσα και βρέθηκα στο επίκεντρο μιας κριτικής από όλο το σύστημα ότι βασικά υποσκάπτω τις σχέσεις μεταξύ Κύπρου και Ρωσίας, τις φιλικές σχέσεις.
Makarios, sorry to interrupt you, but could you please expand on this? Could you explain what happened, how you became a target of the Russian side?
Να μιλήσω 2 λεπτά μόνο για το ιστορικό background για να μπορέσετε να παρακολουθήσετε τι έχω να πω. Η Κύπρος, από ό,τι πρέπει να γνωρίζετε, είναι διαιρεμένη διότι ένα κομμάτι του νησιού είναι υπό τουρκική κατοχή. Αυτή η κατάσταση στην Κύπρο ευνοούσε τα ρωσικά συμφέροντα, διότι ήθελαν πάντα την Κύπρο διαιρεμένη, διότι με διαιρεμένη την Κύπρο ήταν διαιρεμένο το ΝΑΤΟ, ήταν διαιρεμένη η Ελλάδα με την Τουρκία, ήταν η Κύπρος πρώην Βρετανική αποικία, οπότε ήταν μια σύγκρουση μεταξύ Βρετανών, Τούρκων και Ελλήνων, η οποία όσο καιρό το Κυπριακό είναι άλλη, το διαιωνιζόταν και υπήρχε μια αποσταθεροποίηση στο ΝΑΤΟ. Αυτό ήταν το μεγάλο γεωπολιτικό συμφέρον της Ρωσίας, η οποία Ρωσία είχε στρατηγικό στόχο και η Σοβιετική Ένωση και η Ρωσία να αποσπάσουν την Τουρκία από το ΝΑΤΟ και από τη Δύση και να τη φέρουν με το μέρος τους. Οπότε το 1974, όταν έγινε η τουρκική εισβολή, οι Σοβιετικοί διαβουλεύτηκαν με τους Τούρκους και εξασφάλισαν τη συνένεση των Σοβιετικών για να εισβάλλουν στην Κύπρο, ακριβώς για να επιτύχουν αυτό το μεγάλο γεωπολιτικό στόχο. Όμως έχουν πείσει μέσω του ισχυρού μηχανισμού προπαγάνδας που έχουν στην Κύπρο ότι ό,τι συνέβη και στην Κύπρο το 1974, δηλαδή η τουρκική εισβολή, η κατοχή, η συνέχιση όλος αυτός ο ανθρώπινος πόνος ήταν αποτέλεσμα δυτικής συνωμοσίας και ότι ο πραγματικός συμπαραστάτης, ειλικρινής συμπαραστάτης της Κύπρου ήταν η Σοβιετική Ένωση και μετά η Ρωσία. Λοιπόν, το 2013 εξέδωσα ένα βιβλίο όπου ανέτρεπα αυτό το ιστορικό, ότι δεν ήταν έτσι, ήταν αντίστροφα τα γεγονότα. Οπότε ο Σοβιετικός πρέσβης έγραψε ένα άρθρο, Σοβιετική πρεσβεία.
The Russian ambassador, sorry.
Ο Ρώσος, το ίδιο. Δημοσίευσε ένα άρθρο στη μεγαλύτερη κυπριακή εφημερίδα, χυδαίο άρθρο, με χαρακτηρισμούς και με κατηγορούσε ότι υποσκάπτω τις σχέσεις της φιλικές της Κύπρου με την Ρωσία. Αυτός όμως έκανε τη δουλειά του. Όμως όλο το πολιτικό σύστημα εξέδωσαν ανακοινώσεις, με κατηγόρησα, με απέπεμψα. Δηλαδή υπήρξε ένας στόχος το ότι υποσκάπτω τις φιλικές σχέσεις. Και δεν υπήρξε και καμιά υποστήριξη από τα μίντια, από τα άλλα μίντια. Υπήρχαν κάποιες εξαιρέσεις, υπήρξαν. Μια εφημερίδα μόνο νομίζω με υποστήριξε. Όλες οι υπόλοιπες ήταν εναντίον. Αυτό είναι ενδεικτικό του βαθμού της επιρροής που είχε η Ρωσία και έχει στην Κύπρο. Τώρα, για να έρθουμε στα τώρα, μετά την εισβολή στην Ουκρανία, υπάρχει τώρα μια αλλαγή. Δεν είναι όμως όπως στην υπόλοιπη Ευρώπη. Ας πούμε, στην Κύπρο υπάρχει μια πρεσβεία πελώρια για το μέγεθος της χώρας, με 150 τόσους διπλωμάτες. Η Κύπρος δεν έχει εκδιώξει ούτε έναν, σε αντίθεση με όλες τις δυτικές χώρες. Υπολογίζεται ότι ένα ποσοστό από 30 μέχρι 50% των Ρώσων διπλωματών είναι της FSB, που ασχολούνται με τα εσωτερικά ζητήματα. Και αυτός είναι ο λόγος βασικά που τους διώχνουν από τις χώρες, που μειώνουν την επιρροή, τη δυνατότητα της Ρωσίας να παρεμβαίνει. Όμως υπάρχει τώρα μια αλλαγή, κυρίως λόγω φόβου. Δηλαδή τώρα όλα τα φώτα, όλη η προβολή, εδώ σε διάστημα μισή ώρας ακούσαμε 10 λεπτά την Κύπρο. Υπάρχουν στο διεθνή τύπο δημοσιεύματα παντού. Η Κύπρος είναι στα φώτα των προβολέων. Ούτε και ήδη οι Ρώσοι, οι ολιγάρχες τώρα νιώθουν πολύ ασφαλείς στην Κύπρο, διότι είναι εκτεθειμένοι. Όμως το σύστημα το ίδιο αναζητεί εναλλακτικούς τρόπους, όπως ας πούμε οι δικηγόροι ανοίγουν γραφεία στο Ντουμπάι ή κάνουν συνεργασίες με άλλες χώρες και προσπαθούν να διαχειρίζονται αυτή την κατάσταση εκτός Κύπρου. Όμως ό,τι υπήρξε θετικό για να μειωθεί η επιρροή αυτή της Ρωσίας στην Κύπρο, Προήλθε από ξένα δημοσιεύματα, όπως το OCCRP, όπως τα αποκαλύψεις για το Laundromat. Και από μέσα βασικά υπάρχει μια παθητική συμπεριφορά.
Okay, so I'd like to come to the point. No, I would like you to explain what you are doing as an investigative reporter, as an author. Okay, you have uncovered corruption in the past, and you are doing this for many years now. Okay, has your message come through? This is my actual question, and why so, if it has come through or not?
Υπάρχει μια αλλαγή, υπάρχει μια διάθεση στην κοινωνία να ακούσει. Αυτά όμως επειδή είναι δεκαετίες προπαγάνδας και πλύσης εγκεφάλου που γινόταν και επειδή μιλούμε για χρήματα και ο καθένας πιστεύει ότι ξέρεις εντάξει κλέβουμε τους Ρώσους αλλά περνάμε και καλά ας πούμε.
Okay, but the last book the first book you published in the current trilogy, okay, about corruption in Cyprus, has practically exposed the entire political system of the island as crooks and criminals. That message, okay, that you were able, let's say, to present in that book, do you think that found an audience, and at all, what type of an audience was that?
Okay. Ο Στέγιος μιλάει για ένα βιβλίο που έχω εκδώσει πριν 3 χρόνια για τη διαφθορά. Όλα αυτά που είπα προηγουμένως τα εξηγώ σε ένα βιβλίο, το μέγεθος της ρωσικής διαφθοράς στην Κύπρο. Το βιβλίο είχε τεράστια απήχηση στην κοινωνία, δηλαδή νομίζω είναι το πρώτο συμπολίσεις όλων των εποχών για πολιτικό βιβλίο. Το έχουν, εντάξει, είναι μικρός ο πληθυσμός της Κύπρου, είναι λιγότερος από 1 εκατομμύριο. Μπορεί να το έχω διαβάσει 50-60 χιλιάδες άτομα, που είναι πολύ μεγάλος αριθμός για τα δεδομένα. Αλλά δεν υπήρξε ούτε ένα δευτερόλεπτο προβολής από οποιοδήποτε συστημικό μέσο ενημέρωσης, από κάποιο κανάλι, ή δεν έγινε πολιτική συζήτηση, δεν έγινε θέμα, σαν να μην έχει κυκλοφορήσει. Ενώ το έχει διαβάσει το καλύτερο κομμάτι της κοινωνίας, αν κοιτάξετε τις εφημερίδες, ας πούμε, ή να δείτε τα τηλεοπτικά δελτία ειδήσεων, αυτό το βιβλίο δεν κυκλοφόρησε ποτέ, δεν υπήρξε ποτέ. Αυτό είναι ένα παράδειγμα, ας πούμε.
Yeah, okay. So, given all this, how do you assess the situation with media freedom on the island, and to what extent can it hold the executive, the political system accountable to its links to the Russian oligarchy, to the Kremlin, and all these oligarchs who are also investors? Some of them are also citizens of Cyprus in the past years.
Εντάξει, το πρόβλημα είναι ότι υπάρχει ισχυρή διασύνδεση μεταξύ του πολιτικού συστήματος και των Ρώσων ολιγαρχών που χρησιμοποιούν την Κύπρο. Υπάρχουν δικηγόροι και δικηγόροι πολιτικοί που έχουν αυτήν την διπλή ιδιότητα. Ο πρόεδρος μας, ας πούμε, είναι και δικηγόρος, είναι και πολιτικός. Είναι στην επιχείρηση αυτό που λέμε τα χρυσά διαβατήρια, τα golden passports. Ο ίδιος το δικηγορικό το γραφείο, ας πούμε, έχει εκδώσει διαβατήρια σε Ρώσους ολιγάρχες. Τα χρήματα είναι πάρα πολλά, οι σχέσεις, οι επιρροές είναι μεγάλες, οπότε μόνο με πίεση απ' έξω μπορεί να υπάρξει κάποια βελτίωση. Θέλω να πω ότι η μεγαλύτερη, για να γυρίσω λίγο στην εισαγωγή που έκανα, ήταν ότι η Δύση δεν έχει αξιολογήσει όσο έπρεπε τις επιπτώσεις της ρωσικής επιρροής στην Κύπρο. Δηλαδή, η ρωσική επιρροή στην Κύπρο την αντιμετώπισα ένα μικρό κράτος, άστους εκεί, δεν μας ενοχλούν. Όμως είναι οι παρενέργειες αυτής της επιρροής σε σχέση με την Ελλάδα, την Τουρκία, την περιοχή, την ευρύτερη περιοχή, την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, το πώς η Ρωσία χρησιμοποιεί ένα κράτος. Είχαν, ας πούμε, σε ένα από τα βιβλία που χρησιμοποίησα, έχω στοιχεία, πληροφορίες για το πώς η κυβέρνηση της Κύπρου έδινε στην κυβέρνηση της Ρωσίας πληροφόρηση εσωτερική πληροφόρηση της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης για το θέμα των κυρώσεων. Που αυτό είναι διαφθορά, είναι κρατική διαφθορά. Δηλαδή υπάρχει διαφθορά σε επίπεδο ατόμων, υπάρχει και η διαφθορά σε επίπεδο κρατών. Εάν ένα κράτος εξυπηρετεί ένα άλλο κράτος, εντός της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης είναι κρατική διαφθορά. Οπότε η Δύση δεν αξιολόγησε σωστά το ότι αυτό το κράτος ή θα γίνει δυτικό και θα συμπεριφέρεται ως δυτικό εντός της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης ή δεν μπορεί να είναι μέλος.
Okay, so thank you, Makarios. I would like to give, before we go to the audience and ask for questions, okay, if you have any questions, I would like to give the chance to Olga first to make a comment on what Makarios and Šarūnas have said. But a brief one, please.
Very brief.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Cyprus is, again, Russia, is very known for conducting hybrid warfare, which includes cyber attacks, political capture, economic capture, and, anything that falls below the threshold of kinetic warfare. Cyprus is a perfect example of that because not only do you see that, the political government is captured, and instead of conducting affairs on behalf of the citizens, they are doing the Kremlin's bidding, helping them move money, and there have been so many investigations that always lead to Cyprus. And I personally, I don't think I've ever investigated any company without making a stop in Cyprus to find some shell companies there. And this is why it is so important, to clean out this corruption, because the government is supposed to serve the people. It's not supposed to serve the interest of a foreign government or adversary. And, Cyprus is the perfect example for that.
Šarūnas, maybe you have some thoughts?
On Cyprus?
No, generally, to recapitalize.
In general, I just want to stress something I've already said. Just please, guys, join the effort. There's way more money there to trace. There's enough for everyone. Just go on, keep on digging, and do the right thing. Because if we team up, if we do this actual cross-border effort, we can lead to big changes. We can undermine the Russian influence in our countries. We can actually make the regime hurt. We can actually make it stop. We can make the war stop faster. I really, really believe in that. If we do our work properly, if we investigate, if we expose the dirty assets, and if we get them frozen. And this is the best time to do it. So just jump in and dig in.
Good, thank you. So let's take questions from the audience. Mark. Can we?
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation.
You have to turn it on.
Thank you very much for your presentations. It's been amazing, and I've learned a lot by listening to you. I have a question for the three of you. For Olga, how's the situation regarding the lawsuits that were in the UK against people like Scott Stedman or Catherine Belton? Do you think that there is that there is an awareness among the government that the law needs to be changed, and the courts in the UK shouldn't be a platform for the Russians to launch cases against journalism? The second question is for Mr. Makarios. Amazing, and I just wonder, has it changed anything, the situation after February 24th? Is the government more eager to fight, this Russian malign influence, and is the West more eager to put pressure on Cyprus to stop becoming like an entrance for Russian malign influence into the European Union? And then for you, it's a question about Italy. How do you assess how would you measure the influence of Russia, the Russian influence in journalism in Italy? Do you think they control important newspapers, or do you think it's just limited to the social media and Berlusconi TV networks? Thanks a lot.
So, like I said before, Russia is known for trying to silence journalists. In the West, they don't use mafia tactics of, well, in most cases, of threatening the journalist or, throwing them out of windows, but they will use the court systems. And unfortunately, I mean, this Russia's latest assault on Ukraine has like literally opened the eyes of so many, and UK was a favorite destination for Russia to launch these, you know, slaps or lawsuits. And after the war, and I can't believe it took this, you know, much for the war for finally everyone to get their act together on every level. But after the war, the UK government started working on anti-SLAPP laws in order to protect, you know, journalists inside of Britain and prevent Russian oligarchs and businessmen, kleptocrats from using the system to sue these journalists.
Μετά την εισβολή στην Ουκρανία, ναι, η κυβέρνηση προσπαθεί περισσότερο για να εφαρμόσει τα... Και πιστεύω ότι εφαρμόζει γενικά. Μπορεί να υπάρχουν κάποιες περιπτώσεις που δυσκολεύεται, αλλά δεν είναι το ίδιο όπως πριν και υπάρχει και με πολύ μεγάλη πίεση απ' έξω από ξένες κυβερνήσεις, ειδικά από τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, και παρακολουθούν την κατάσταση που δεν είναι εύκολο τώρα. Δεν είναι, σίγουρα τίποτα δεν είναι το ίδιο όπως πριν.
I must say I'm not a big expert on Italy, but when it comes to Russia, it's not my fault. It's something brought up by somebody way smarter than me. Corruption is one of Russia's principal exports. And when it comes to corruption in Italy, I think Silvio Berlusconi is a synonym for corruption in Italy. And now he's getting back to power. We know his criminal connections. We know his power when it comes to actually controlling Italian media. So this is definitely a factor, but I can't estimate how strong it is, you know, in comparison to the way it was 5 or 10 years ago. Also when it comes to Russian influence, they use corruption and they use crime. We have both in Italy, and unfortunately, the current coalition that won the election also has connection to both. So it's sad, but I do have that a Russian factor was there during the election. And of course, Salvini, his results dropped dramatically, but still, he's a part of this. And he's being endorsed by the leaders of the coalition, which means that we will have Russian influence present in the future government of Italy. That's a fact.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Perhaps. Καλησπέρα.
Ήθελα να κάνω μια ερώτηση στον κύριο Μακάριο, γιατί σας ακούω έτσι με μεγάλο θαυμασμό. Είναι λίγο πιο προσωπική, αλλά θέλω να την κάνω. Περιγράφετε μια κατάσταση ενώ όσο γράφετε τα βιβλία και κάνετε τις έρευνές σας, που ακούγεται πολύ μοναχική. Θέλω να πω, λέτε ότι οι συνάδελφοί σας δεν γράφουν για τα βιβλία σας όταν εκδίδονται σε εφημερίδες. Όταν σας τυχαίνουν τα πολύ σκληρά γεγονότα, μόνο μία εφημερίδα, ας πούμε, σας υποστηρίζει. Ακούγεται ένα εξαιρετικά μοναχικό τοπίο. Και αναρωτιέμαι πώς ανταπεξήλθατε σε αυτό. Και προσωπικά και πνευματικά και επαγγελματικά και ηθικά. Και δεύτερον, αν ποτέ από πιο πάνω, αν σας πιέσανε ή δεχτήκατε απειλές πιο έμεσες ή άμεσες για τη δουλειά που κάνετε.
Εντάξει. Μου δίνετε την ευκαιρία να πω ότι λόγω της έρευνας που έκανα κατά της διαφθοράς, όταν έγινε αντιληπτό το τι ερευνούσα και το που έφτασα, άρχισε να παρακολουθούνται οι επικοινωνίες μου, το σπίτι μου, μου κατέβασα τις κάμερες ασφαλείας από το σπίτι, περίεργοι τύποι περπατούσαν έξω, προσπαθούσαν να με εκφοβήσουν και να με εκβιάσουν. Εντάξει, δεν μου αρέσει να κάνω δεν είναι εύκολο πράγμα, δεν το θεωρώ αυτό ότι είναι ηρωισμός, είναι μια δύσκολη προσωπική κατάσταση, αλλά αποφάσισα ότι έπρεπε να τους αντιμετωπίσω διαφορετικά. Μετά τελειώνεις ότι δεν έχεις ρόλο και λόγο και προσπαθώ από εδώ και 3 χρόνια, ερευνώ την υπόθεση της παρακολούθησης των επικοινωνιών μου και είμαι στην ευχάριστη θέση να πω ότι έχω αποτελέσματα και επιστημονικά αποτελέσματα και τη Δευτέρα κυκλοφορεί ένα καινούριο βιβλίο δικό μου στο οποίο καταγράφω όλη αυτή την ιστορία, το πώς έγινε και πώς, και ελπίζω να έχει κάποιο αποτέλεσμα στην κοινωνία, κάποια επιρροή, κάποια επίδραση. Ο λόγος που το έγραψα, που άρχισα να το γράφω, ήταν ότι πιστεύω ότι η δημοσιοποίηση, και αυτό είναι ένα μήνυμα και προς τους συνάδελφους, ότι η μεγαλύτερη ασφάλεια όταν διερευνάς τέτοιου είδους υποθέσεις είναι πλέον η δημοσιοποίηση και να γνωρίζουν ότι υπάρχουν και άλλος κόσμος που έχει πρόσβαση στις πληροφορίες σου, στα αρχεία σου. Νομίζω μετά από το τραγικό γεγονός που έγινε στη Μάλτα, υπάρχει μια μεγαλύτερη ευαισθησία στον κόσμο και μια φοβία στο σύστημα ότι αυτές είναι οι λύσεις που μπορούν να δώσουν. Από την άλλη, επειδή γράφω για ολιγάρχες, γράφω για Ρώσους, δεν ξέρεις από πού θα σου έρθει, αλλά να ελπίσουμε ότι... νομίζω ότι μετά τον πόλεμο στην Ουκρανία νιώθουμε λίγο πιο ασφαλείς, διότι είναι προσανατολισμένοι αλλού τώρα, νομίζω, παρά...
The Kremlin is busy with other things. The last question, the lady over there.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. I'd like to ask anyone, and also quoting something Olga said, you said that Western media is laundering, or has been laundering Russian propaganda without realizing, and the journalism, Western journalism, has to do a better job understanding what is happening inside the country. Is this from following up to Crimea and between Crimea and February 2022, you mean, or do you think this has changed now? This is, when would you, is there any change? Do you see any change, since the invasion, this year's invasion, I mean?
I mean, it has gotten a little bit better, but I mean, I had, I believe it was CNN on yesterday, and they had a chart, Russian-backed separatist, showing the map. And I'm like, there are no Russian-backed separatists. These are Russian, mercenaries and agents and various military groups. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but words matter. And especially for Ukrainians who are right now under assault. So I think that when media chooses to cover, and I understand, a lot of journalists, investigative journalists are lucky because they really don't have a very tight deadline. They have time to investigate, and but day journalism, they have a breaking story constantly. They have to keep up with the news, and sometimes it's hard for them to understand the region. And I think that they should speak with people in the country or the region to find out from them, because I mean, I know for Ukrainians, they're happy for the media coverage, but at the same time, it's aggravating for everyone when you see Russian-backed government or fake, election with Russian-backed government. I believe it was Reuters who the other day reported 97% voted to join Russia. That was the headline. And I'm like, are you kidding? Can we put, a proper headline? This is not an election. So they have a lot of work to do. And I think the best way is to consult with people from the country they're reporting on.
Good. So we run out of time. So I would like to thank everybody for attending. And I hope that you found the conversation interesting. Thank you very much.